The transport that brought her in was an old turboprop with one engine that ran rough, and I remember thinking, when it taxied up out of the heat shimmer at the end of our cracked runway, that it had no business still flying. That was the kind of thing they sent us at Tower Rock by then. Old airframes, old parts, and people the bigger bases didn't have a slot for. We were a forward field on the Margrave Plateau, a strip of patched concrete and 3 hardened shelters scraped into a shoulder of rock 1,100 feet above a brown river valley, and we were the last fast jet field before the line went quiet and then went bad. We were not where careers were made. We were where they were finished, or parked, or forgotten. I was the operations officer that season, a major with 11 years of fighters behind me and a back that told me about every one of them when the weather turned. My name is Russ Calloway. I was 36, and I thought I had already seen the shape of how my service would end, a tour at a dying field, a few more after, a quiet retirement nobody would notice. I ran the flight schedule, I flew the missions nobody else wanted, and I had grown a hard crust over the part of me that used to believe a place like this could still matter. So when the manifest came down 2 days early and told me we were getting a supernumerary pilot, one extra body, no airframe assigned, no role defined, I read it the way I read most things that came down to us. As ballast, as somebody else's problem made into mine. I walked out to the line when the turboprop shut down, because that was courtesy, and because I wanted to see what they'd sent. The ramp dropped, and the first 3 off were ground crew, and then there was a pause, and then she came down the ramp alone with a single kit bag over her shoulder and a flight helmet under her arm. She was not what the ready room would have drawn if you'd asked them to sketch a fighter pilot. She was on the smaller side, lean the way a long-distance runner is lean, with dark hair cut short and shot through with gray at the temples, though she couldn't have been much past 40. She had a face that had been out in weather for a long time, the skin around her eyes creased pale where she'd squinted into 1,000 bright horizons. She wore her flight suit the way a mechanic wears coveralls, like a tool, not a costume. She didn't look around the field the way new arrivals always do, taking inventory, sizing it up. She'd already taken its measure from the air. She just walked down off the ramp, set her bag down, and stood there in the heat with her helmet under her arm, waiting to be told where to go. "You the extra," I said. "It came out harder than I meant it. The heat does that." "I'm the extra," she said. Her voice was low and even and gave nothing away. "Reporting in." "You got a name." She told me a name. "I'm not going to give it to you, because by the end of this you won't think of her by it. And neither do I. We came to call her something else, and that other name is the one that matters. But that first afternoon she was just a name on a manifest and a body I didn't have a use for, and I treated her like one." "We're a fighter field," I said. "Single seat. We don't have a backseat to put you in, and we don't have a spare jet that's worth the fuel. I don't know what the wing was thinking sending us a supernumerary, but I'll tell you the same thing I'd tell anybody. You're here to fill a seat if I lose a body, and until then you stay out of the way. Clear." I expected something. A flicker of offense, an explanation of her qualifications, the little speech everybody gives about why they're more than the slot they've been dropped into. She gave me none of it. She looked at me with those pale creased eyes and she said, "Clear, Major," and she picked up her bag. And that was the thing about her that I didn't understand for a long time, the thing it took me a fight to understand. She didn't need me to believe she was somebody. She already knew what she was. My opinion of her was weather to her, something to fly through, not something to argue with. People who have nothing to prove stop trying to prove it, and I had spent 11 years around people who had everything to prove, so I read her stillness as emptiness. I read the absence of a fight in her, as the absence of anything worth fighting for. I had her quarters assigned to the far hut, the one with the bad fan, and I went back to my schedule, and I put her out of my mind the way you put out of your mind a part you've been issued that doesn't fit anything you're working on. You set it on the shelf. You forget the shelf. The ready room found her before I had to introduce her, the way the ready room finds everything. We had 8 pilots at Tower Rock that season, not counting me, and they were young. Good sticks, most of them, but young in the way that a forward field makes worse instead of better, full of swagger that hadn't been sanded down yet because there was nobody around to sand it. The senior of them was a captain named Dale Hardung, a big blond kid from cattle country with hands like a farmer and an instinct in the air that I'd have killed for at his age, and a mouth that ran ahead of his sense by about a half-second on the ground. Hardung ran the ready room the way the biggest dog runs a porch, and the others took their cue from him. And when an unassigned pilot showed up with no jet and no job, Hardung did what the biggest dog does. He sniffed her over and he decided she was nothing, and he let the rest of them know it. I came into the ready room that first evening to post the next day's schedule, and they were already at it. She was sitting in the back corner with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of her, and a folded chart she wasn't looking at, and the 8 of them had arranged themselves so that the room's energy ran past her and around her like water around a rock. Hardung was holding court by the coffee urn. "So I says to the man, sir, with respect, if you're going to send me a wingman, send me one who can hold a line," Hardung was saying to general laughter, "and instead they send me a ferry driver." He said it loud enough to carry to the corner. He said it for the corner. "No offense, ma'am, I'm sure you've logged a lot of hours. Hauling jets from one base to another's honest work. Somebody's got to drive the truck." "None taken," she said from the corner, and went back to not looking at her chart. That should have ended it. It didn't, because her not rising to it read to Hardung like a win, and a young man who thinks he's winning doesn't stop. "I mean it, though," he said, turning so the room could see him be magnanimous. "You ever take one of these up angry, Margrave airframes, I mean, fast movers, not the trainer pattern, the real thing, low and loud, somebody shooting back?" He smiled. "Because there's a difference between flying a jet and fighting one, and I'd hate for you to find that out the hard way over my valley. I should have shut it down. I want to be honest with you about that, because this is a confession as much as anything, and a confession that leaves out the speaker's own part isn't worth the breath. I was the ranking man in that room. I'd been handed a pilot I'd decided was ballast, and here was the ready room confirming my decision for me, doing the work of dismissing her so I didn't have to, and some small mean part of me was glad to let them. So I didn't shut it down. I posted the schedule. Her name wasn't on it, of course. There was no airframe for her, and I let Hardung have his porch, and I told myself the laughter was just young men being young men. She watched all of it. I saw that later, going back over it in my mind the way you go back over a thing you got wrong. She wasn't enduring the mockery. She was reading the room the way she'd read the field from the air. She was taking the measure of every pilot in it, who was loud and who was quiet, who flew with his hands and who flew with his head, which of them would freeze and which would hold, and she was filing it away, because that was what she did. She read things and she filed them and she waited, and the waiting wasn't weakness. It was the most dangerous patience I have ever been near. "You don't say much," Hardung said to her finally, when even he could feel the joke going thin. She looked up from the chart. "No," she agreed, "I don't." And there was something in the flat plainness of it, no heat and no apology, that made the room go a half-beat quiet before somebody laughed to cover it. I felt it and I didn't understand it. It was the quiet of a man who has just heard a sound in the dark and can't place it, but knows in the animal part of himself that he should pay attention. The room didn't pay attention. Neither did I. We laughed it off and we went to dinner, and we left her in the corner with her cold coffee and her chart. And I have thought since that of all the things I did wrong that week, leaving her in the corner was the smallest and somehow the one I'm most ashamed of. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that she had been studying our jets all afternoon. I learned this from the crew chief, a weathered master sergeant named Prout, who'd been turning wrenches on fast jets longer than most of my pilots had been alive, and who didn't waste words on anybody he hadn't decided was worth them. Prout came to me the morning of the 3rd day with a look on his face I hadn't seen before, a look like a man who's found something he can't quite explain. "That's supernumerary," Prout said. She was out on the line at 0430. Doing what? Walking the jets. He scratched his jaw. Not pre-flighting, we weren't flying her, just walking them, slow, put her hand on the leading edges, climbed up and looked in the intakes with a flashlight, sat in the cockpit of 2-3 for 40 minutes in the dark, not the radios, just sitting, working the stick and throttle with her eyes closed. He paused. Then she found me and she asked me about the number 2 jet, the one with the slow spool. The one I've been writing up for 3 weeks, and nobody at the wing'll send me a part for. I knew the jet, tail 221. It had a compressor that hesitated on a hard throttle slam, a half-second cough before it caught and made full power, and it had nearly killed a young lieutenant named Cosby on a go-around the month before. I'd grounded it for anything but straight-hand level, and I'd been fighting the wing for the part ever since. What'd she want to know? I said. She wanted to know the exact RPM where it coughs, and how long the hang is, and whether it's worse cold or hot. Prout looked at me. Major, I've been doing this 30 years. Pilots don't ask that. Pilots ask, is it fixed or isn't it? She asked me to characterize the failure, like she was planning to fly it anyway and wanted to know exactly how it'd betray her so she could plan around the betrayal. He shook his head slowly. I told her the numbers. She thanked me. She wrote them on the back of her hand. He held up his own hand, demonstrating, and I could see it had unsettled him in a way he didn't have language for. Who writes a jet's death on the back of their hand, sir? I didn't have an answer. I told Prout to keep the bad jet grounded and I went about my day, and I'd like to tell you that the conversation woke me up, but it didn't. It scratched at me. It sat in the back of my mind the way a sound in the dark sits there. But I was a busy man at a dying field and I had a war to lose slowly, and a quiet woman who walked the jets at 4:30 in the morning was a curiosity, not a warning. I filed it the way she filed things, except I filed it wrong. I filed it under odd. She'd have filed it under useful. She came to me that afternoon, the 3rd afternoon, and asked to be put on the flight schedule. She didn't make a case of it. She stood in the door of my little plywood operations office with a chart rolled under her arm and she said, "Major, I'd like to fly, any tail, any tasking. Put me on as a 2-ship wingman and let me show you I'm not in the way. And I want you to understand the man I was when I said what I said, because the man matters. I was tired. I'd been fighting the wing for parts I wasn't going to get and flying missions that weren't going to change anything. And I had decided, in the small economy of a tired man's heart, that this woman was one more thing being asked of me that I didn't have the resources to give. I looked at her standing in my doorway, and I saw a ferry driver who wanted to play fighter pilot at the one field too far gone to tell her no, and every mean tired thing in me came up at once. I've got 8 pilots and 7 flyable jets, I said. I don't have a seat for you, and even if I did, I let it hang, and then I said the thing I am most ashamed of, the thing I would give a great deal to take back. Even if I did, I'm not going to put a pilot I don't know over my valley on the strength of a logbook and a quiet manner. We're not a ferry route out here. People shoot at you. I need to know what a stick can do before I trust them with my younger guys, and I don't have the fuel or the time to find out what you can do, so you'll stay the supernumerary. You'll fill a seat if I lose a body, and until then, I'd said it once already. I said it again because cruelty repeats itself. Until then, you stay out of the way. She looked at me for a long moment. She wasn't angry. I keep coming back to that because it would have been easier if she'd been angry. Anger I could have dismissed. She looked at me the way you look at whether you have to fly through, not arguing with it, just gauging it, deciding the heading that gets you past it with the least damage. "Clear, Major," she said. And she rolled her chart a little tighter and she went back to her hut with the bad fan, and she didn't ask me again. That night I posted the next day's schedule and her name wasn't on it, and Hardung saw it wasn't on it, and the ready room understood that the Major had ruled, and the porch belonged to the biggest dog, and the quiet woman was nothing. And I went to my bunk feeling like a man who'd handled a problem, and I slept. And the thing about that night that I cannot forgive myself for is how well I slept. The scramble came 4 days later, at the worst possible hour, in the worst possible way. We'd had a recon package working the far side of the valley, 2 reconnaissance birds, slow and unarmed and crammed with cameras, escorted by a 2-ship of our fighters. It was a milk run, the kind we'd flown 40 times. They'd go out at first light when the air was smooth, photograph a stretch of road the intelligence people were nervous about, and come home for breakfast. Hardung led the escort that morning with a lieutenant named Pell on his wing. I was in the operations hut with my coffee, listening to the radio with half an ear, when the milk run turned into the worst morning of my life. The first sign was Hardung's voice, and the thing I noticed before I noticed the words was the pitch of it. Hardung had a low, slow, cattle country voice, and it had gone up half an octave and lost its drawl. Tower Rock, this is Sabre lead. We have multiple bogies, multiple coming off the deck out of the east sun. They were waiting for us, a burst of static. Pell's hit, he's trailing, I've got stand by, break right, Pell, break right. I was on my feet with the coffee spilling and the duty phone already in my hand. Across the field the scramble horn was going up, that long climbing wail that turns your stomach over, and pilots were spilling out of the ready room half-dressed and running for the jets. But I knew before I looked at the schedule, before Prout's voice came over the line, what the morning had done to us. Because it was the worst hour. It was the hour when half the field's jets were down for the overnight maintenance cycle, panels off, fuel drained for a fuel cell inspection, a wing jacked up. We had 7 flyable jets on paper. That morning at that hour, with Hardung and Pell already engaged and trailing smoke at the far end of the valley, we had 2 on the line that could launch in under 10 minutes. 2. And one of those 2 was Tail 221, the bad jet, the one that coughed on a hard throttle slam, the one I'd grounded for anything but straight hand level. I've run that morning 10,000 times in my mind. The arithmetic of it was simple and it was merciless. Hardung and Pell were out, engaged and hurt. The 2 recon birds were defenseless and slow, and a long way out, with God knew how many enemy fighters between them and home, and the intelligence people would later tell us it was at least 8. A coordinated ambush sprung out of the rising sun by a real adversary who'd grown tired of us photographing their roads. We had 2 jets that could fly. One of them was a jet I'd grounded as unsafe, and I had, on my field, exactly 1 more qualified pilot than I had good jets. I got Cosby into the 1 good jet, the young lieutenant, white-faced, game in over his head and knowing it. And then I stood on the line in the rising wind with the scramble horn dying away, and I looked at Tail 221, the bad jet, the coughing jet, and I understood with a falling feeling that I had no one to put in it. My pilots were all committed or launching. Cosby was rolling. There was no one left. No one except the supernumerary. She was already there. I don't know how she got to the line so fast. She must have been moving the instant the horn went up. Must have been half-dressed in flight gear and waiting for exactly this, because by the time I turned from Cosby's departing jet she was standing at the foot of the ladder of Tail 221, the bad jet, the one whose death she'd written on the back of her hand 4 days before, with her helmet on and her visor up and her G-suit already zipped, looking at me. Not asking, just looking, waiting for the only word that mattered now, which was mine, and which I had no good way to withhold any longer. That jet's not safe, I heard myself say. It was the truth and it was nothing, and we both knew it was nothing. I know exactly how it's not safe, she said, calm, that same flat calm, no heat in it, no fear in it either, which frightened me more than fear would have. Master Sergeant Prout characterized it for me. It coughs at 68% on a slam from idle. The hang is 0.6 seconds. It's worse cold, and that jet's cold. She had her hand on the ladder rail. So I won't slam it from idle. I'll stage the throttle through the cough every time. It'll cost me a half-second on every acceleration, and I'll plan the whole fight around owning that half-second instead of being surprised by it. She looked at me, and for the first time since she walked down off that turboprop ramp, there was something underneath the calm, and it wasn't anger and it wasn't fear. It was the thing I should have seen the first day. It was certainty. Major, Hardung and Pell are out there hurt, and your recon birds are going to die in about 6 minutes if nobody comes. I'm the last pilot on your field, and that's the last jet, and I can fly that jet's exact failure better than your best man can fly a perfect one. Put me on the schedule. There are moments when a man's whole picture of the world has to turn over at once, and it is a violent thing, and there's no time to feel it. I felt the turn start and I shoved it down, because there wasn't time, and I made the only decision the morning had left me. Go, I said. She went up the ladder of that broken jet like water going uphill, and Prout was already there strapping her in, and I stood on the line and watched Tail 221, my unsafe jet, my coughing jet, the one I'd have grounded forever if the wing had ever sent me the part, taxi out fast and swing onto the runway. And I heard her on the radio for the first time, checking in, that low even voice with no fear in it, and I heard her stage the throttle up through the cough the way she'd said she would. Smooth and deliberate, riding the half-second hang like a thing she'd practiced her whole life, and the jet caught and made full power and rolled, and lifted, and turned east into the rising sun toward the place where my men were dying. And I went back into the operations hut to listen to her save them, not yet knowing that I was about to hear the finest piece of flying any man on that field would witness in his life. The operations hut at Tower Rock was a plywood room with a long radio console, a chart of the valley pinned to the wall, and a single grimy window that looked east toward the morning. And it became, in the next 20 minutes, the place where I learned what I was. I had a speaker on the wall that carried the tactical frequency, and I had a radar repeater, an old green scope that showed the whole valley as a slow sweep of light. And as the seconds ticked, I watched the picture on that scope and listened to the speaker and lived through a battle I could not fly, in a jet I would not have trusted, with a pilot I had refused to schedule. There were 6 of us in the hut by then, me, 2 radio operators, Prout who'd come in off the line still wiping his hands, and a couple of the maintenance troops who had nowhere to put themselves and couldn't bear to stand outside not knowing. We watched the scope. We listened. And one by one, over the next 20 minutes, every man in that room stopped being the thing he'd been when the morning started. The picture on the scope was a horror. I could read it the way I'd read 1,000 of them, and what it told me was that we'd already lost. Hardung was a single contact down in the western corner, low and slow, which meant hurt, dragging himself home with whatever he had left. Pell, I couldn't find Pell, and not finding a friendly on the scope is the worst thing there is, because it means one of 2 things and only one of them is survivable. The 2 recon birds were a pair of slow blips way out east, crawling west toward home, and stacked between them and us, between them and any safety at all, was a loose knot of fast contacts, 6, 8, hard to count as they merged and split, that were maneuvering with the unhurried confidence of hunters who knew their prey couldn't fight back and couldn't run. And coming up from the west, alone, climbing through the cough of a broken engine, was one friendly contact, Tail 221, her. Saber package, this is, and here she paused, just a half-beat, the first and only time I heard her hesitate over anything, and I understood later it was because she was deciding in that half-beat whether to use her call sign. It would mean something to use it. It would tell certain people listening exactly who had just entered their morning. She decided. This is Saint. I'm a single coming to you from the west, angels low and climbing. Recon flight, I need you to turn hard for home and descend to the deck and run, run, run. Don't look back, don't maneuver, just run. I'll bring the fight to me. Saber lead, say your state. The name came over the speaker, Saint, and it meant nothing to me that morning, just a call sign, the way these things are, a word a pilot wears. It would mean a great deal to me within the hour. But in the moment what I heard was the voice under it, that low, even unhurried voice, and what struck me, what struck all of us in the hut, was that she was the only person on the frequency who didn't sound afraid. Hardung's voice when he came back was ragged, climbing, a young man holding himself together with both hands. Hers was a flat, calm pond. She had flown into the worst tactical picture I had ever seen, and she sounded like a woman reading a grocery list. Saint Saber lead, Hardung breathing hard. I'm hit. I'm losing fuel. I got Pell punched out. I saw a chute, I marked it, but I can't get back to him. I got 4 of these things on me and I can't shake. Understood, you're done fighting, Saber lead. You did your job, now you fly home. Heading 265, nose on the deck, firewall what you've got left and don't turn for anything. Those 4 on you are mine now. Acknowledge and go. A pause. Then Hardung, and something in his ragged voice had changed. Some of the panic gone out of it because somebody on the frequency was steady and the steadiness was contagious. 265 on the deck. They're all yours, Saint God, they're all yours. And then she went to work, and I am going to tell you what I watched on that scope and heard over that speaker as carefully as I can, because it deserves care. Because what she did over the next 20 minutes was not luck and was not a miracle and was not the kind of thing that makes a good movie. It was the opposite of those things. It was arithmetic. It was a woman doing a brutally difficult job correctly, over and over, refusing every shortcut, for 20 minutes without a single mistake, in a broken jet, while outnumbered, with men's lives stacked on every decision. It was the least flashy and most astonishing thing I have ever witnessed. The first thing she did was the thing none of my young pilots would have done. She didn't charge in. The hot blood in a fighter pilot when his friends are in trouble is to bore straight into the fight and start shooting, and it gets young pilots killed, and it would have gotten her killed against 6. Instead, she used the one thing she'd been hoarding: the sun. She'd come from the west, low, and she climbed the broken jet up into the morning sun behind the enemy knot, staging the throttle through the cough every single time so the engine never coughed at a moment that mattered. And she put the sun at her back so that the 4 fighters peeling off Hardung to deal with the new threat would have to look into the glare to find her. I watched her contact swing wide and high and patient on the scope, taking the long way, giving up the fast intercept for the right one, and I heard Prout beside me let out a low breath and say, almost to himself, "She's not in a hurry. Look at that. She's got 6 of them and she's not in a hurry." The first kill came 40 seconds later, and it was so clean I almost missed it on the scope. One of the 4 that had broken off Hardung came up looking for her, climbing into the sun, blind, and she was already there above and behind where the geometry said the blind man would have to be. And she didn't take the long shot. I heard her not take it. I heard her voice calm, narrating to no one the way some pilots talk themselves through a fight. Not yet, not yet. Let him commit. She let the enemy fighter climb past the point of no return, let him commit his energy upward where he couldn't easily turn, and only then did she fall on him from above with the sun behind her, and there was a short flat call, splash 1, and on the scope 2 contacts became 1. She'd waited for the geometry to give her a shot she couldn't miss instead of taking a shot she could. And the difference between those 2 things is the difference between a pilot who lives and one who doesn't. "That's one," said one of the radio operators, a kid named Hobbs, in a whisper like he was in church. I have thought a great deal in the years since about that first kill and why it told me everything if only I'd had the wit to read it then. She had been over the fight for less than a minute. She was outnumbered 6-1 in a jet that could betray her at any hard throttle slam. The reasonable thing, the thing fear or pride would have demanded, was to announce herself, to charge, to even the odds the only way it felt like they could be evened, by doing something fast and loud and visible. She did the opposite. She made herself invisible. She spent her first 40 seconds not shooting, climbing into the sun, giving up tempo and surprise of speed for surprise of position, because she had understood something that takes most pilots a career to learn and breaks the ones who never do. That in a fight you are losing, the worst thing you can do is hurry, and the best thing you can do is be patient enough to make the enemy hand you the kill rather than reaching for it yourself. She didn't take the shot she could make. She waited in the middle of a 6-on-1 for the shot she could not miss. And the discipline that takes to hang above a committing enemy with your friends dying on the radio and your own fuel bleeding away and a broken engine under your hand, and to wait and wait, and not fire until the geometry is perfect, is a thing I have only ever heard described and only ever heard once, that morning, in a flat, calm voice narrating itself through the kill. The second kill was harder and it cost her, and it was the moment I stopped breathing. The other three of Hardung's pursuers had found her now. The splash gave away her position, and they came around hard, 3-on-1, and the scope became a knot of merging contacts so tight I couldn't read it. And for a few seconds all I had was her voice, and the things it told me. 2 at my 4 o'clock high, 1 low, the low one's the smart one, a grunt, the sound of a pilot pulling hard against the G, fighting her own body and the jet at once. Going for the low one first. He's the one who can hurt me. And then, the only time her voice tightened just slightly on the edge of the engine note. Come on stage, catch. And I understood she'd had to accelerate hard, had to ride that half-second cough at the worst possible instant, had to plan for the betrayal of the jet exactly the way she'd told me she would, staging the throttle through the hang while 3 fighters tried to kill her. And the jet coughed and hung and caught when she'd planned for it too, and not a moment when she hadn't. And she came off the bottom of a maneuver I couldn't see, and there was that flat call again. Splash 2. And 3 contacts and the knot became 2. But the 2 that were left had her bore-sighted now, and she was low on energy from the fight, and there was a long, ugly 30 seconds where the scope showed 2 enemy contacts driving a single friendly down toward the deck. And I gripped the edge of the console so hard my fingers went white, and Prout was saying under his breath, "Get out of it, get out of it. You've done enough, just get out of it." And she didn't get out of it. Because Hardung was still dragging himself home not far away, and the recon birds were still slow, and the job wasn't done. She did something instead that I have described to other fighter pilots in the years since, and watched them go quiet. She dove for the deck, for the valley floor, the brown river, the rock, and she pulled the 2 fighters down after her into the terrain, into the place where altitude couldn't save anybody and the ground was a third enemy that played no favorites. And she flew that broken coughing jet down the river valley at a height that I will not specify because you would not believe me, low enough that the radar repeater lost her in the ground return, and for 4 seconds I had nothing, no contact, no voice, nothing. And I thought she was gone. Then the speaker again, that impossible calm, splash 3, he flew into the ridge, I didn't even shoot him. A pause, his wingman's reconsidering. She had used the ground. She had taken 2 pursuers into terrain so unforgiving that one of them, pressing too hard in country he didn't know, in a fight he was sure he was winning, had flown into a ridgeline at the bottom of the valley, and she hadn't fired a shot to make it happen. She had simply been better at the place than he was, and the place had killed him. And the last of the 4, the one whose wingman had just become a smear on a ridge, had lost his appetite, and he turned away east, and she let him go, because chasing him would have taken her away from the recon birds, and she had not flown into this fight to run up a score. She had flown into it to get my people home. 3 down. 4 if you counted Pell's killer, but we didn't know about that yet. 3 down, and she was alone and low on fuel and energy in a broken jet, and the hardest part of the morning was still in front of her, because the recon birds, the 2 slow, defenseless camera planes she'd actually come to save, still had the rest of the enemy not between them and home. I want to stop here and tell you what was happening in the hut, because it matters as much as what was happening in the air. When she'd launched, 20 minutes before, there'd been 6 men in that operations hut who thought of her, to whatever degree they thought of her at all, as the ferry driver, the supernumerary, the body filling a seat. Hobbs, the radio operator, had laughed at Hardung's jokes in the ready room. The maintenance troops had helped strap her into a jet they'd been told was unsafe, with the careful blank faces of men who think they're sending somebody off to get hurt. And Prout had characterized a failing engine for her the way you'd note down a dead man's measurements for a coffin. Now there were 6 men standing around a green scope holding their breath, and not one of them was thinking the word ferry. They were watching a master at work, and a master at work changes everybody in the room whether they understand the craft or not, because skill at that altitude is visible even to people who can't fly. The maintenance kid had his hand over his mouth. Hobbs had stopped pretending to log and was just listening, leaning toward the speaker like it was warmth. And Prout, old Prout, 30 years on the line, who didn't waste words on anybody, Prout was standing very straight with his cap in his two hands, the way a man stands at a graveside or a flag raising, and his eyes were wet. And when she called Splash 3, he said, quietly to the room, to himself, to her 3,000 feet up and 3 miles out where she couldn't hear him, "That's the best stick I ever heard. That's the best stick I ever heard in my life." I hadn't said anything in a while. I couldn't. The turn I'd shoved down on the flight line when I'd said go was coming up in me now, the whole picture of the world turning over, and the man it was making me into was a man who had to live with what the old man had been. I had grounded that jet. I had benched that pilot. I had stood in my doorway and told her to stay out of the way, and I had slept well, and she was out there now riding the exact failure I'd condemned the jet for, using it as a weapon, because she'd done the work I was too tired and too proud to do. I had read her stillness as emptiness, and the emptiness was about to bring my people home through the eye of a needle. Saint Saberlead's feet dry, he's home. He made the field one of the radio operators, his voice cracking with relief. And across the field we heard it too, the wounded howl of Hardung's jet coming over the threshold trailing a thread of smoke, slamming down hard and rolling out long, and somebody outside was cheering. But in the hut nobody cheered because the recon birds weren't home and she wasn't home, and the morning wasn't over. "Copy, Saber leads down," she said. "Recon flight, where are you? Give me a position. I'm coming to you, but I'm low on gas and I need to be smart about it." The recon lead came back, and his voice was the voice of a man who flies a slow, unarmed airplane for a living and has spent the last 20 minutes listening to fighters die around him, knowing he couldn't do a thing about his own life. "Saint, recon's about 12 miles east of you on the deck, doing everything this old girl's got, which isn't much. We got," his voice wavered, "we got 4 of them on us. They're taking their time. They're playing with us. They know we can't do anything." 4. She had splashed 3, driven 1 off, and there were still 4 enemy fighters between the camera planes and home, and she was alone, low on fuel in a jet that coughed, and she had to cross 12 miles and break up a 4-ship and shepherd 2 slow blind airplanes home, and she had Prout did the math out loud, looking at the fuel state she'd called earlier and the clock. "She's got maybe 8 minutes of fuel to do 20 minutes of work," Prout said, and his voice broke on it. "She can't. She can't do it. Tell her to come home, Major. Tell her she did enough. Tell her to bring my jet home." And I keyed the mic to do exactly that, to give her the out, to order her home, to let her off the arithmetic that was going to kill her. And before I could speak she came over the frequency. And I have thought ever since that she knew what I was going to say and got there first on purpose, because she didn't want the out, and an order to come home would have been a thing she'd have had to disobey, and she didn't want to make me give an order she'd have to break. "Tower Rock, Saint, calm, that bottomless calm. I know my fuel state. I've done this math before, don't call me home. I'm going to get your recon birds and I'm going to bring them across the line, and then I'll worry about my gas. Some things you do the arithmetic on and the arithmetic says no, and you do them anyway because the other answer is 2 airplanes full of men go down and you flew home with fuel in your tanks and had to live with it." A pause. "I've lived with that once. I won't again. Tower Rock, I'll talk to you from the other side. Saint out." And she went east, low and fast and coughing, toward 4 fighters and 12 miles and not enough fuel, to do the impossible thing for the second time in 20 minutes, and the hut went silent as a church, and I set down the microphone I'd been about to use to call her home, and I did not pick it up again. The last 10 minutes of that fight I could not fully see, and I think that's fitting, because the people she was saving couldn't see her either, and that turned out to be the truest thing about her. She did her best work where no one was watching. The recon birds were 12 miles east and on the deck, and the scope could barely hold them there in the ground clutter, and her contact crossed toward them and then merged into the same wash of return, and for long stretches I had nothing but voices, hers calm, the recon leads, frightened and trying not to be. And underneath them both, on the edge of the speaker, the empty hiss of a frequency where life and death were being decided out of my sight. I have flown a lot of combat. The hardest thing I have ever done was stand in that hut and listen to a fight I couldn't see, fought by a pilot I'd refused to trust, and be able to do nothing but witness. She talked to the recon birds the whole way in, and the talk was its own kind of mastery. She had 4 fighters to break up and 2 terrified men to keep alive and almost no fuel to do it with, and she spent some of her words she could barely spare, breathing hard against the G on keeping the recon lead steady. "Recon, you're doing fine. Keep her on the deck. When I tell you to turn, turn hard and don't ask why, and the rest of the time fly straight and trust me. You're going home." "Say it back to me." And the recon lead, voice shaking, said it back. "We're going home." "That's right. Now give me 30 seconds of straight and level while I take the back 2 off you." She took the back 2 off them the way she'd taken the first 3, not with a charge, but with patience and geometry and the sun, which had climbed higher now, but which she still used like a tool, coming out of the brightest part of the sky where a man's eyes water and fail. Splash 4, flat and calm, and then a harder stretch, 20 seconds of grunting maneuver where the engine note rose and I heard her stage it through the cough twice, fast, at the edge of disaster, riding the broken jet's exact failure like a horse she'd broken herself, stage, catch there. And then splash 5. And now there were 2 enemy fighters left and 2 recon birds and 1 woman with maybe 4 minutes of fuel and 12 miles still to cross to the line. "Saint, you're down to," I started, because the fuel state she'd called was a horror now, and she cut me off, not unkindly, just final. "I know what I'm down to, Tower Rock. Stand by, I'm working." The last 2 enemy fighters were the best of the bunch. That's how these things go. The careless ones die first and the good ones are what's left at the end, and they didn't make the mistakes the others had made. They didn't climb into the sun. They didn't press into the terrain. They stayed disciplined, one high and one low, working together, trying to bracket her so that whichever way she turned to engage one, the other would have a shot. It was good flying. Against a tired pilot, against a low-fuel pilot, against a pilot in a broken jet, it should have worked. I listened to her, read it instantly. 2 of them. They're being smart, high-low bracket. They're going to make me choose. And I listened to her refuse to choose, which is the thing that I still don't fully understand how she did, and which the few fighter pilots I've described it to don't either. She went at the bracket head-on, straight up the middle, forcing both of them to commit at once, and at the last instant. And I'm telling you what she told me afterward, walking me through it on the back of a fuel chit with a pencil, because I couldn't see it on the scope. At the last instant she pulled up and over the high man so violently that the broken engine coughed and nearly quit, hung for its full 0.6 seconds and longer, and she let it hang. Let the jet go slow and quiet over the top with almost no power, hanging on the edge of a stall above the high fighter who'd expected her to turn into the fight, and instead found her falling on him out of his own blind spot. "Splash 6, she said, and her voice for the first time had something in it that wasn't quite calm, not panic, not triumph, just the smallest human crack of a person who has spent everything she had and knows it, and then immediately, before any of us could feel anything, "Last one's bugging out east. He's done. Recon, turn for home now, heading 265, descend to the deck, firewall it. We're going home." 6 enemy fighters in something close to 20 minutes, alone, outnumbered, low on fuel, in a jet I had grounded as unsafe, and the only one she'd fired her whole load to kill was the last. 2 of the 6 she'd killed with the sun and the ground and the geometry, taking the shots the situation gave her instead of forcing the shots she wanted, and that Prout said it, watching the last enemy contact flee east off the scope. That's why she's still alive. She never took a bad shot. 20 minutes and she never once took a shot that wasn't already a kill. You know how hard that is. You know how hard that is when your friends are dying and your hands are shaking. She had no shake. She had no shake the whole time. And then there was the matter of her fuel, and the matter of 12 miles, and the matter of whether the woman who just saved everyone could save herself. And the hut went quiet again in a different way. because the recon birds were turning for home now and climbing onto the scope clean and safe, and accelerating toward the line, 2 slow blips going home with all their men, and the single fighter contact that had shepherded them was falling behind, slowing. Because she was doing the thing you do when you're out of fuel, the thing they teach you and pray you never need. She'd pulled the throttle back to the last setting that would keep her airborne, and she was trading altitude for distance, gliding the broken jet on a thread, doing the arithmetic of weather lift and weight, and the thin margin of remaining fuel added up to the runway at Tower Rock, or to a field somewhere short of it. Tower Rock, Saint. Calm again, the crack closed over. Recon flight's clean and climbing and they'll beat me home, get them down first. I'll be a few minutes behind and I'll be slow and quiet because I'm bringing this in on fumes. So clear me a runway and have the crash crew up, but tell them to relax. I've done this before. I'm going to put your jet back on your concrete in one piece. A pause and then, and this is the part I think about most, because it told me everything about her, she said. Master Sergeant Prout, you copy? Prout fumbled for the microphone. Saint Prout, go. You characterized this jet for me 4 days ago. The cough at 68%, the .6 hang, worse cold. You were exactly right, every number, and I flew 6 kills on the back of your numbers. And 2 of those men's airplanes had 4 other men in them who are going home this morning, because an old crew chief did his job right and didn't round anything off. A pause. I just wanted you to know that before I land, in case the landing's interesting. Your numbers brought them home, Master Sergeant, not just me, you saint out. And old Prout stood there in the operations hut with the microphone in his hand and his cap in the other, and the tears running plain down his weathered face. 30 years of not wasting words on anybody undone in a single morning by a woman who'd made sure, before she risked her own landing, to give a crew chief his share of what she'd done. And I understood then, watching him, the thing about her that the certainty had always been pointing at. She didn't take, she gave. She'd given Hardung his steadiness back over the radio, given the recon lead his nerve, given Prout his due, and she'd done it all in the middle of fighting for her life, because a person who is truly secure in what she is doesn't have to hold anything back for herself. She had nothing to prove, so she spent everything she had on everyone else. The recon birds came home first, just like she'd said. 2 slow, battered camera planes crossing the threshold and rolling out and shutting down on the ramp, and the men who climbed out of them got down on the concrete, and some of them knelt and some of them just stood with their hands on the warm skin of the airplanes that had carried them through, and they asked one question, all of them, the same question, before they asked anything else. They asked who Saint was. And nobody on my field could tell them, because nobody on my field knew. She came home last, on fumes, gliding that broken jet down the final approach so slow, and so quiet that from the line it looked like it was barely moving, like a hawk settling, and she greased it onto the numbers with the dead engine and rolled out and the prop, the broken compressor, the cough, the half-second hang, the failure I'd grounded her for wound down to silence at the far end of the runway with the tanks bone dry. And the crash crew rolled out to her and found her sitting in the cockpit with her hands still on the controls and her eyes closed, not asleep, just still, the way Prout had found her at 4:30 in the morning 4 days before, sitting in the dark working the stick with her eyes closed, taking the measure of the thing, filing it away. I was the first one to her jet. I had run the length of the line and I got to the ladder as they were getting her out, and she came down slow, stiff from the G and the cold and the 20 minutes, and she stood on the concrete and looked at me, and I did not know what to say to her, because there was nothing a man like me could say to a pilot like that, and so I said the only true thing I had. "Who are you?" I said. It wasn't a challenge this time. The first day I'd asked her something like it, and it had been a wall. This was the opposite of a wall. This was a man at the bottom of his own ignorance asking to be let up. She looked at me for a moment, and then she reached into the leg pocket of her flight suit and took out a folded paper, soft and worn from being carried, and held it out to me and said, "It's easier if you read it. Most of it's blacked out. The parts that aren't will tell you enough. I unfolded it on the flight line with my hands not quite steady. It was a service record, or what was left of one after the people who decide such things had gone through it with a heavy black marker. Most of it was redacted, long black bars where the units should have been, the places, the operations, the specifics. But the black bars themselves told a story to a man who knew how to read them, because you don't black out a ferry pilot's record. You black out the records of people who did things the country has decided never officially happened. And in the gaps between the black bars and the parts they'd left me, I read enough. I read a flight record that ran to numbers I'd never seen on one document. I read citations with the details blacked out, but the words outnumbered, and alone and defensive engagement, surviving here and there like rocks above a flood. I read, in one surviving line, a description of an action in which a single pilot had held off a superior force long enough for a damaged friendly package to withdraw, the rest of it gone to black. And I understood that she had done this exact thing before, more than once, that the morning I had just witnessed was not a miracle she'd reached for but a craft she'd practiced in places I would never be cleared to know about. And at the bottom, where a call sign goes, below all the black untouched, was the one word she'd spoken over the frequency, the word the enemy fighters had heard come up out of the west that morning and known, some of them, exactly what it meant. Saint. There was a note beside it, in the spare official language of such things, explaining the call sign, and I'll tell you what it said because it's the only part of her record I'm sure I'm allowed to repeat, and because it was the truest thing on the page. It said the call sign had been given to her by the men she'd covered, the ones on the ground and in the slow airplanes who never saw her, who only knew that when everything was lost something had come between them and the end and held there until they were safe and then was gone. They never saw her face. They didn't know her name. They only knew they'd been saved by something they couldn't see, watching over them from above, and so they'd called her Saint, and it had stuck, and it had gone into the record, and it had become the only name she let anyone use. I folded the paper back up along its soft, worn creases, and I handed it back to her, and I came to attention on the flight line of my own dying field, and I saluted her. I want to be precise about that salute, because it was the most honest thing I have ever done, and I had to earn the right to do it through being wrong in front of God and everybody for a week. I had landed that jet she flew on a list of grounded aircraft. I had told her to stay out of the way twice. I had left her in the corner of a ready room with cold coffee while younger men called her a ferry driver, and I had let them, because their dismissal was convenient to mine. I had refused to find out what she could do because I was too tired and too proud to spend the fuel, and the fuel I'd refused to spend on finding out was a thimble next to the fuel she'd just burned bringing my people home through 6 enemy fighters. So when I came to attention, I was not just saluting a superior pilot. I was confessing. The salute was the only apology big enough, and it still wasn't big enough, and we both knew it. I told you to stay out of the way, I said, holding the salute, my voice not as steady as hers ever was. I grounded that jet. I left you in the corner. I was wrong about all of it, every part and I found I couldn't finish it and I didn't have to because she returned the salute crisp and unhurried, and that was its own kind of mercy. You sent me when it counted, Major, she said. A lot of men wouldn't have. You had every reason on paper to keep me grounded and you said go anyway. Don't carry the rest of it. Carry that part. Which was, I would learn exactly like her. She gave me back my dignity with one sentence, the way she'd given Hardung back his steadiness and Prude his due, because she had so much of her own that she could afford to hand some to a man who just admitted he'd had none. And then the rest of them came. They came down the flight line in 2s and 3s, the whole field, drawn the way people are drawn to the place where something has happened that they'll be telling for the rest of their lives. The recon crews came first, the men she'd actually saved, and they didn't salute because saluting wasn't enough and they knew it. They came up and took her hand, one after another, and a couple of them couldn't speak at all and just held onto her hand with both of theirs and nodded and let go. The maintenance troops came, the kid who'd had his hand over his mouth in the hut, and they stood at the edge of it not sure they had the standing to come closer, and she saw them and she said, "You turned that jet for me in 8 minutes flat, didn't you?" And the kid said, "Yes, ma'am," and she said, "Then you've got as much right to stand here as anybody," and pulled them into it. And then Hardung came. I'd watched Dale Hardung land 20 minutes before, trailing smoke, hauling himself and his shot-up jet home on guts and not much else, and he'd been pulled out of the cockpit gray-faced and shaking, and they'd sat him down on the ramp with a medic, and he'd refused to go to the aid station until he knew how it ended, until he knew the recon birds were down and Saint was down, until he knew Pell, and Pell, I should tell you, was recovered 3 days later from where he'd punched out, alive. Found because Hardung had marked the chute, and she had filed even that, had passed the mark to the rescue people on her way to the recon birds, one more thing given away in the middle of the fight. So Hardung knew, by the time he came walking down the line on unsteady legs, exactly what she'd done, all of it. And he was the one I was most afraid for in that moment, because he was the one who'd called her a ferry driver to her face in front of the whole ready room, and a proud young man with that on his conscience can break in ugly ways. He didn't break ugly. He came down the line and the men parted for him because they knew, and he stood in front of her, this big cattle country kid who'd held the porch and run the room, and his face was working and he couldn't get anything out for a second. And then he did the thing that told me he was going to be a good officer someday, maybe a great one. He didn't make excuses. He didn't explain himself. He came to attention, swaying a little, still gray, and he saluted her, and he held it, and he said in that low, slow voice with all the swagger burned out of it, "Ma'am, I called you a ferry driver in front of my whole flight. I said you didn't know the difference between flying a jet and fighting one." His voice cracked clean across. "You pulled 4 of them off me when I was done. You sent the mark that got Pell back. There's no," and he gave up on words and just held the salute, shaking, and let the salute say it. She returned it, and then she did the thing for him that she'd done for all of us. "Captain," she said, "you took 2 recon birds into a sucker punch nobody could have seen coming, and you got hit, and you still got your wingman's chute marked, and you still got yourself and your jet home. That's not nothing, that's most of everything." She paused. "What you said in the ready room, let it go. I've been the new pilot nobody scheduled at a dozen fields. The good ones always come around. You came around faster than most. Now go let the medic look at you. That's an order from a pilot you'll listen to, and we'll fly together when they fix your jet and mine." And Hardung went, and he was crying and not ashamed of it, and the men let him pass. Then the rest of them saluted. It wasn't ordered and it wasn't organized. It started with Prout, who'd been standing a little apart with his cap in his hands, and who put the cap on his head just so he could take it off again in a salute, 30 years of a man who didn't waste words finding the one gesture that didn't need any. And then the radio operators. And then the maintenance troops, the kid included. And then the recon crews, who'd already shaken her hand and now wanted to do this too. One by one, and then all together, the whole field of Tower Rock came to attention on that cracked concrete in the climbing morning, and saluted the quiet woman they'd called a ferry driver 4 days before. And she stood there and took it the way she'd taken everything, without flinching and without feeding on it, level-eyed, certain. And when it was too much even for her, when the only crack I ever saw in her opened for just a second, she didn't let it spill. She just brought her own hand up and returned the whole field's salute at once, one gesture, holding it until they'd all dropped theirs. And then she dropped hers last, the way a commander does, the way the senior person in any formation is the last to lower the hand. I've been to a lot of ceremonies in my service. Medal pinnings, change of commands, the formal saluting of formal things. I have never seen anything like the salute on the flight line at Tower Rock that morning, and I never will, because it wasn't ordered, and it wasn't for the cameras, and there weren't any cameras. And it was given by men who had spent the morning being wrong, and had the grace to admit it all at once. in the one language soldiers have for the thing that's too big for words. She stayed at Tower Rock another 6 weeks, and they were the best 6 weeks that field ever had. She flew the schedule. I put her on it that same afternoon, top of the board, and nobody ever called her a supernumerary again. She flew with Hardung when his jet was fixed, and he came back from those flights quiet and changed, a better pilot every time because she taught the way she fought by giving everything away. She taught my young guys to read the ground and the weather and the sun, to refuse the bad shot, to never round anything off, to plan around the betrayal of the gear instead of being surprised by it. She walked the line with them in the dark at 4:30, the way she'd walked it alone that first week, and she made them put their bare hands on the cold leading edges and close their eyes and learn each airframe's particular honesty, its small lies, the exact place it would let them down so they'd never be surprised by it. She made us, in 6 weeks, the best small field on that line, and then her orders came and she folded her one kit bag and she got on another old turboprop, and she went away to wherever they send people whose records are mostly black bars, and we never saw her again. I have her records, one unredacted line written down somewhere, the call sign and the note about the men who gave it to her. I take it out sometimes. I'm an old man now, older than Prout was that morning, and I've told this story to a lot of young pilots over the years, the ones who come to me full of swagger that hasn't been sanded down because there's nobody around to sand it. I tell them about the supernumerary nobody scheduled. I tell them about the broken jet and the 6 fighters and the 20 minutes. I tell them about the sun and the ground and the shots she refused. And then I tell them the part that matters, the part I was too tired and too proud to understand for a whole week, the part it took a salute on a flight line to teach me. I tell them that the most dangerous person on any field is rarely the loudest one, that the man who has to tell you what he is, isn't it yet. That real skill is quiet because it doesn't need an audience, and real strength is generous because it has enough to give away. I tell them I once stood in a doorway and told the finest pilot I would ever know to stay out of the way, and that she did, until the morning I needed her, and then she flew a jet I'd grounded through 6 enemy fighters on fumes and brought my whole world home, and gave the credit to a crew chief, and gave a frightened captain his dignity back, and gave me an apology I didn't deserve, all in the same 20 minutes, and never once raised her voice or shed a tear or asked for a single thing in return. And then I tell them her name, not the one on the manifest, the other one, the one the men she saved gave her because they never saw her face and only knew that when everything was lost, something they couldn't see had come between them and the end and held there until they were safe. Saint. I tell them she watched over men who never knew her name and asked for nothing and flew away, and that if they spend their whole careers trying to be a tenth of what she was, they'll have spent them well. And the swagger goes out of them while I'm talking, the way it went out of Hardung, the way it went out of me, and they sit there quiet, and I know that for at least a little while they understand. Then I send them out to walk their jets in the dark, the way she did, and to put their hands on the leading edges and learn the airframe's true name, and to remember that the quiet ones are the ones to watch, and that the country is held, more often than it will ever know, by people it never sees, asking for nothing, who do the arithmetic that says no and go anyway, because the other answer is something they cannot live with. That was the finest piece of flying I ever witnessed, in a jet I'd called unsafe by a pilot I'd called nothing. I got to salute her once on a cracked flight line at the end of the world. It's the proudest moment of my life and the most ashamed, and they are the same moment, and I have made my peace with that because she gave me leave to. Carry that part, she said. So I do. I carry that part. And I carry her name, and I give it away, the way she gave everything away, to every young pilot full of swagger who needs to learn the thing I learned too late. The quiet one is the one to watch. She was always the one to watch.